Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Elizabeth Deane-Hughes. I apologize on behalf of Isabel de Carries, the chair of the trustees of Moray House, who had a personal emergency, and we'd like to wish her well. Welcome to this afternoon's Oil and Gas and Environment, a review. This panel will consist of Dr. Adams and Melinda Janki. Representatives from the Environmental Protection Act were invited to be on the panel, but they withdrew with no explanation given. ExxonMobil was also invited to be on the panel as a replacement after the busy. They had prior commitments. For those joining Moray House for the first time, Moray House is a private, non-partisan, non-profit based in Georgetown, Guyana, and is dedicated to the promotion of Guyanese culture and public discourse. After my brief introduction, each member of the panel will speak briefly for about 15 minutes. Then the panel would have an inter-discussion between the two members. Adams. Afterwards, we would invite questions and comments from the floor. Moray House was founded on the ethos that a culture thrives and develops where ideas circulate and are robustly debated and interrogated. Over the past 10 years, we have convened panels to discuss everything from the state of West Indian cricket to constitutional reform. This in the Moray House Trust program. One is to commemorate the birth of Guyana's greatest poet, and the other is to mark the untimely death of the groundbreaking historian, Dr. Walter Rodney, in 1980. Both men, the poet and the historian, had a political conscience. Both realized that democracy is inseparable from a vibrant public discourse. It simply cannot function editorials, political speeches, and books, and Walter Rodney's groundings to ingrain that notion in the psyche of our people. It was a key part of their praxis. After Walter was killed on Friday, the 13th, 1980, Martin wrote a poem, and it was entitled For Walter Rodney. It begins with these lines. They bury the voice, they assassinate. The ability to converse, to speak frankly and openly was one of the casualties of the Burnham era. There were consequences to expressing one's opinions in public. Consequences ranging from lengthy tax investigations to the loss of jobs if they were employed in the public sector, or a beat with their lives. After a while, a collective self-edit mechanism kicked in. Conversations in the public sphere quite literally died, and with it, a cornerstone of democracy. Half a century later, the shadow of this history hangs over us, and once again, there appears to be a retreat from the public sphere, for example, by our public officials. To Rodney or Martin Carter, who are here still, they might observe with some dismay that over half a century after the former colony emerged from the embrace of Mother England, our economy is still wedded to the export of primary commodities. Oil has simply been added to that list of gold, bauxite. The recent announcement of the deal to export raw manganese to China and the possibility of several new gold, large-scale and gold mines suggest that this pattern is not about to change. Here is the crux of the matter. How do our political leaders view their role and their remit? Do they see themselves primarily as brokers of our oil, gas, gold, and minerals, or custodians of our environment? Our savannas, our ecosystems? Are they put in post primarily to sell or to safeguard? Are they primarily salesmen or stewards? Before the advent of gold, Guyana sought to position itself on the corner of the world stage as the preserver of rainforests, of a primary ecotourism destination, a pioneer in low carbon development. Development strategies are both legacies, albeit from different political dispensations that flow from this endeavor, as it is more recent tilt to marketing carbon credits. A duality has long existed in our policies. Some might call it Jekyll and Hyde, the Jekyll and Hyde approach. At the same time, as we were earning plaudits for Iracrama and later the LCDS, we were in and gold mining operations, such as Barama and Omai, with a few conditions and precious little oversight. We continue to remit our own miners to foul our rivers with degrading and mercury, with dredging and mercury, whenever gold is to be found, wherever gold is to be found. Has been borne overwhelmingly by those far away from the centers of power and patronage. Landscapes degraded by loggers and rivers polluted by dredgers, and mercury are beyond the public gaze and therefore out of our minds. Only occasionally do we make notes, as for example, when the collapse of the tailings dams at Omai occurred and the release of millions of gallons of cyanide-laced toxic waste into the Demerara in August 1995 occurred. A more recent spill when a reservoir collapsed in the manganese holding in Port Kaintuma in September 2021 barely raised an eyebrow. Our politicians are forgetful, and our people suffer from a collective dose of attention deficit disorder when it comes to these events. We had all better sit up and take notice. The arrival of oil and gas and now the construction of an undersea gas pipeline has raised the stakes dramatically higher. We are dazzled by the possibility of oil revenues. We are not focused on the risk at all. There are the cumulative effects of the sustained and prolific offshore drilling, and there's an exponential risk of a blowout, a malfunction, an oil spill, a gas leak. Without proper protections and oversights, we are moving from a game of poker to one of Russian roulette. Our nation, our economy, indeed the Caribbean region, will not recover from a major oil spill. Other nations, such as Norway, have straddled twin roles as oil producers and a role at the forefront of environmental protection and conservation with some success. But this is a delicate balancing act, resting on the sturdy foundations built up over time. They include a robust legal framework to protect the environment, a network of regulatory institutions to implement the laws and monitor operations, transparent and rigorous systems of appraisal, a wealth of data in public domain, widespread public awareness of trust and of the foregoing. In much of this, there's a wearying sense of déjà vu. 5 years ago, at an earlier Moray House Trust Panel, Melinda Janki pointed out that we were relying on antiquated databases of our marine stocks in the environmental assessments conducted prior to drilling, where such databases existed at all. We still don't have the data. We still have not compiled inventories. Now that the deep sea drilling has started in earnest, absent the data, no one can conclusively answer the questions where all of the fish have gone. No one can explain to the thousands of Guyanese engaged in the fishing industry, sometimes for generations, what has happened to their livelihoods. And as others have pointed out, occasionally handouts from the state are no substitute for a loss of livelihood. A few years ago on another panel, a representative of the indigenous peoples organizations raised the issue of free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to large-scale projects and initiatives. She pointed out that the consultations seem to be treated as simply a sharing of information rather than the sharing of views. These impressions persist. In February 2016, we hosted a panel to discuss the closure of the Wales estate. Cane farmers, sugar workers, and former chairs of Gaisuco shared a microphone. It was by some measure the most stimulating discussion that the trust has hosted. As I hand over to the panel to make the decision, I would like to first introduce Melinda Janki. She's an attorney at law both internationally in Guyana for over 20 years. She has been an in-house attorney at British Petroleum, and she's worked in the Baku-Tbilisi-Sahu, which is a pipeline that runs from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. Melinda was also responsible for the drafting of the Environmental Protection Act in Guyana. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Melinda. Over to you, Melinda.
Thank you very much, Liz. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here for this event. I want to start by saying thank you to Moray House and the organizers for inviting me to come this afternoon. And Liz, that was an excellent introduction and summary. Thank you very much. 4 years ago, I was on a panel at Moray House, and I said that oil would make Guyana poorer, not richer. And people didn't want to hear that. Today, I think we're quite clear that the promised wealth has not arrived. Guyana is racking up debt that has to be paid to Exxon out of Guyana's oil. And so this vast wealth that was promised will never arrive. We're seeing the environmental harm. It is referred to the loss of livelihoods for the fishermen. The cost of living has gone up, but not wages. And we are now probably in the midst of the oil curse. A tiny elite is getting richer, but the majority of people look to be getting poorer. The government is overspending, borrowing money, burdening future generations with debt. And this afternoon, I have another unwelcome message. Guyana, as you know, is a carbon sink. Guyana's forests take out more greenhouse gases than the population emits. And that has a value. Every ton of greenhouse gas that is removed from the atmosphere has a value. But as the government of Guyana seeks to convert Guyana to an oil producer emitting greenhouse gases, then that reduces Guyana's potential income as a carbon sink. It reduces the net amount of carbon removed by the forest. Every ton of greenhouse gas from oil production costs Guyana in potential revenue. Added to that, we have a contract that is inequitable, unjust, and it is astonishing that any competent minister could have signed such an agreement. The Vice President, when leader of the opposition, stated in Parliament, our incompetent government trudged in there unprepared and stuck us with a contract that would harm us for decades into the future. They sold our patrimony. Well, nothing has changed, except perhaps the government. It's the same contract. And I believe that quote says it all. We are now in fully in extractivism. The oil is being taken out. For every 100 barrels, 75 barrels of oil are deducted for Exxon's expenses and for the expenses of its partners. And this is 100% cost recovery. I know there has been some confusion about this. Some people think it's only 75% of the costs that are recovered. That is not the case. It's 100% cost recovery. It's taken out at the rate of 75% of production every month. And the addition, whatever is left, is added to the next month and to the next month and to the next month. With each new discovery of oil, with each new FPSO, with each new exploration, the costs go up, and the time at which Guyana might see any real revenue is put off indefinitely. Add to that the admission by the government that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity, and what we're looking at is massive debt, a shorter time period in which to make any money from oil, and with every day that passes, the growing risk that Guyana will be saddled with stranded assets and with the responsibility for shutting down the wells. Now, that's not a very attractive future. The wells are about 2 miles below the seabed under immense pressure, and the ocean is about 1 mile deep. This is not an easy exercise. This is extremely difficult to do. It requires technical expertise, and it's extremely expensive. So we're seeing what is really a snatching, a grabbing at comparatively small amounts of money, with the problems put off for the future. Now, one of the items that Liz mentioned, and I'm going to take a little sidetrack here, was the issue of free, prior, informed consent. And I want to urge people as much as possible to forget that. Free, prior, informed consent in relation to Amerindian communities in Guyana is a Trojan horse. What we have in the legislation is that you may not do anything unless the community agrees and you obey the conditions that the community imposes. Free, prior, informed consent is a Trojan horse by the commercial sector. You must have an equal arrangement. It's not good enough to say, well, I consulted you beforehand. You gave me your consent freely. I gave you all the information. No, 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 no. You tell me everything I want to know, and in return, I tell you what my demands are. And if you don't agree, there's no deal. So I think it's most unfortunate that free, prior, informed consent has become a sort of currency in Guyana, when actually what the legislation provides for is free, prior, informed, conditional consent. And this, I think, leads very nicely to the next part, which is it's the legal framework. We have in Guyana a robust legal framework to protect the environment. It consists really of 3 things: the Environmental Protection Act, the Constitution of Guyana, and then the stuff that's not written, what we call the common law, the things that are found in the decisions of the judges and in the way that law has evolved. I'm going to ask you to bear with me and to forget for this next hour or so everything that you think you know about the Environmental Protection Act, and to approach this with a completely open mind. Civil society has said that we must change the Environmental Protection Act, and the World Bank has said we must change the Environmental Protection Act. Civil society, I think because people genuinely don't understand it, and therefore risk trying to change something that is immensely powerful. The World Bank, obviously, because the law is powerful, and the World Bank is not a friend to Guyana. The World Bank is a friend to the fossil fuel sector. During the questions and answers, I would be very happy if people would raise their concerns, and we can look at the extent to which the legislation actually addresses the issues that you feel need to be addressed. The harm to the environment, the dangers, anything that currently worries you and that you want an answer to, please raise it in the questions, and we will do our best to give you an answer. So does the Environmental Protection Act cover oil and gas? It doesn't mention oil and gas anywhere. You can read it from cover to cover, and it doesn't mention oil and gas. Well, of course it covers oil and gas. You see, the Act isn't sector specific. It floats above. It's overarching legislation, so it covers everything. It covers mining, forestry, agriculture, tourism, wildlife, all those roads that the government is proposing to build, covers aviation, waste, genetically modified organisms, and so on. The trigger is whether there will be a significant impact on the environment or whether there might be a significant impact on the environment. And if there is, then the legislation has some very strong provisions as to what has to happen next. First of all, there has to be an environmental impact assessment, and that impact assessment has to cover pretty much everything. It has to cover the impact on people, on flora, on fauna, on the habitats of species, on the soil. It has to cover the cultural heritage and the natural landscape. It has to say how much of a resource will be degraded, how quickly the natural system will deteriorate. It has to cover the ecological balance and ecosystems and the interaction between all of these things. Now, the Environmental Protection Act was drafted in 1996, 26 years ago. At the time, nobody was concerned about greenhouse gas pollution. It's what we call climate change today. Quite an unfortunate terminology, actually, but I'll come back to that. So when the Act was drafted, climate change was not a big issue. However, the Act covers climate change. It defines the environment to include the atmosphere and the climate. And it specifically says that you have to evaluate the impact on the environment, so the air and the atmosphere, and you must state what the impact is on air and climatic factors. In essence, every single oil company must put into their environmental impact assessment a description. They have to identify the effects, they have to describe, and they have to evaluate the direct and indirect impacts of what they're doing. So this is a very strong provision. And as we will see a bit later on, the Environmental Protection Agency is simply not enforcing that. So they are allowing production to go ahead without assessing the full impact of what is happening. And that's not just on the environment, that is also many other things. When you look at the rest of the Environmental Protection Act, one of the key provisions is the amount of information that is to be given to the public. And this brings me to the other side of the equation. On one side, you have the obligations that are placed on the Environmental Protection Agency, obligations that are not being met. And on the other side, you have the rights of the public, the rights to information, the rights to participation, and ultimately the right to go to court to enforce the Environmental Protection Act. As you may know, there are currently 4 cases in court that I'm involved in, actually 3. One case is complete where the ESSO's permit was cut down to 5 years. That permit expired last week and the EPA immediately issued a new permit. I will come to that in a moment. The other cases are a case that challenges the petroleum production license on the grounds that the minister could not grant a license to ESSO and its 2 partners, Hess and CNOOC Nexen, because Hess and CNOOC didn't have an environmental permit, and you may not do oil and gas without an environmental permit. The court disagreed with us, and that matter is now in the Court of Appeal. The other case is a case that challenges the flaring The case basically says that the Environmental Protection Agency acted unlawfully when they modified or purported to modify the permit to allow flaring. The EPA and ESO have said in court that they have the right to flare and that the modification was a restriction on the flaring. The judge has said that she will give a decision in July or August. The papers, of course, filed at the court are public documents which everyone can read. The third case, which is brought by Dr. Troy Thomas and Kodad de Freitas. Dr. Thomas is the dean at the University of Guyana. Kodad de Freitas is a young Wapichan from the Rupununi. That case argues that Guyana's entire oil and gas production is contrary to Article 149J of the Constitution, which guarantees the right to a healthy environment. So there are these court cases, there are things that people can do to enforce the law. There are many other things that can be done. So where are we? As I mentioned, last week, the EPA renewed the permit. Now, what happens when the permit expires? Well, under the regulations, ESO is supposed to apply for a new permit, and they should have done so by the 1st of November 2021. Did they do so? We don't know. The EPA has not answered that query. An application should have been made by ESO. Whether it's been done, we don't know. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency does not have the power to renew or to issue a new permit unless there has been no material change in circumstances. If there's been a material change in the circumstances, they cannot renew the permit. Well, did the EPA do any kind of assessment to determine whether there has been a material change in circumstances or not? Again, we don't know. But I would suggest that obviously there have been material changes in circumstances in the last 5 years. Everybody will be aware of the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change over the last 5 years. Those reports giving us an increasingly dangerous future, explaining the impact of greenhouse gas pollution on the atmosphere, the resulting global warming, leading in turn to the disruption of the climate system, rising sea levels, and the melting of the ice caps, and that greenhouse gas pollution also causing the ocean to become more acid. Note, I have not used the word climate change anywhere because I think that it does not describe the situation. And one of the contributing factors to our situation now, which the Vice President has described this as an existential threat, one of the reasons that we are heading it this way is the use of terminology that conceals rather than reveals the grave threat to life on this planet. We're talking about climate change when we should be facing up to the reality of greenhouse gas pollution and asking the obvious question, where is that greenhouse gas coming from? Why don't we stop it? And bringing in environmental justice, because we must not look at this in a ahistorical way. The reality is that the so-called developed countries, the so-called rich countries, got that way because their economies were based on fossil fuels, and they are responsible for the stock of greenhouse gas currently in the atmosphere. They have an obligation to the rest of the planet to remove that. And I don't mean by the sort of dodgy technical solutions being mooted by the fossil fuel sector, such as carbon capture and storage, but solutions that are in harmony with the earth and with the limits of this planet, hard scientific limits. So we have a situation in which there have been material changes, and yet the permit was renewed without any public consultation, without any public information, without any public knowledge. When we talk about the importance of transparency, you can see why we have a serious problem in the oil and gas sector. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to just give you a little look at the environmental permit as is, and then talk about the EIA on which it continues to be based. Now,
Sorry, Melinda, you have 5 minutes. You can do that in, if you don't mind.
Yep, thank you. So the new permit now contains very early on something called a project grievance mechanism. And this is something that is taken from the World Bank. My immediate advice to anybody who's reading this, anybody in Guyana, ignore this. It's outrageous. ESSO and the Environmental Protection Agency answer to the laws of Guyana, and they answer to the courts. Nowhere does anybody in this country have to submit to any kind of project grievance mechanism. If people's rights are being violated, if the law is not being followed, there is an automatic right to go to the court. So I would say, do not, under any circumstances, be distracted into playing what is really a ridiculous game. Another provision is that the oil company ESSO only has to disclose scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which are basically the emissions they produce themselves and the emissions that come when they purchase electricity. According to the environmental permit, ESSO does not have to reveal its scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions that come from burning the gas and the oil. That seems to be completely untenable. I would say that it's illegal, because the Environmental Protection Act makes it absolutely clear that you have to state the direct and indirect impacts of what you're doing. Obviously, the emissions from burning that oil, if not a direct impact, are an indirect impact, because they're there. There's nowhere else to put them. So what we are seeing is that the Environmental Protection Agency is not using the Environmental Protection Act to regulate the oil and gas sector the way the law says it should be done. Now, that's bad enough. But this new permit, as far as we know, there has been no new environmental impact assessment. And we know that because every environmental impact assessment has to have public involvement in it, starting from the very beginning with scoping out the terms of reference and with enabling people to say what they want the EIA to cover, and entitling people to make submissions, and requiring the developer, ESSO, the consultant, to listen to what people have to say, and entitling you to go to court if you think that that EIA doesn't take into account the points that you made and the EPA has not given you a good reason. Now, we have not used that provision. I think one of the issues that we constantly come up against is people saying, oh, there's nothing I can do. Oh, there's nothing I can do. Well, that sort of attitude is a bit defeatist. Then I would urge people to look at the Act and to start using it, because it's there to be used. So this EIA that continues in existence it's completely inadequate. The data that were relied on were completely inadequate. Now, the EIA and the original permit were dated the same day. The EIA, the Environmental Impact Statement, runs to about 1,500 pages. It's dated the 1st of June 2017. The permit that was issued was dated the 1st of June 2017. When did the EPA read that permit? Read that Environmental Impact Statement and draft the permit? The EIA team, ESSER's EIA team, appeared to have some difficulty in working out what was there. They state, for example, that they acoustically detected marine mammals on 264 occasions. And then they say, unidentified delphinids were by far the most frequently detected species with 254 detections. 254 times out of 264 times, they didn't know what they had found. They used a fish list from 1962. Now, bear in mind, this is being provided to the EPA in 2017. 1962 fish list. And they had problems, unsurprisingly, in identifying the fish. Volume 2, page 28 says, the most commonly observed fish species was the unidentified flying fish. This would be funny if it was somebody else's country. Now, the LISA-1 operations are located 120 miles offshore, 120 miles away. What do you think ESSER's EIA team used for their birds surveys, their bird information? They used a checklist for the coast and the interior of Guyana that had been produced by the Smithsonian some 10 years earlier. Unsurprisingly, they had a problem identifying birds. They say,
1 minute, please.
Additional wildlife observed included 59 avian species, 10 of which were unidentifiable. In my last minute, I'm going to conclude by saying that we have strong laws in Guyana. We have a constitution, we have the Environmental Protection Act. We cannot rely on government and the Environmental Protection Agency to protect Guyana from oil and gas. The rules are there, the law is there, the courts are there. The choice is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda, for that excellent presentation, especially bringing the stark reality of 75 barrels being deducted from 100. The duality of the language and the glibness with which it is used, and your call to action. I hope we all hear that. Now on to Dr. Adams. I'd like to introduce Dr. Adams, who will be giving the second presentation today. Dr. Adams has had 30 years experience in the U.S. Department of Energy. He recently served as the Executive Director of Guyana's Environmental Protection Agency. He holds a PhD in engineering, in environmental engineering, and MS degrees in groundwater hydrology and geological engineering, petroleum engineering, and a BSc in civil engineering. Dr. Adams worked 6 years with Amoco as a senior petroleum reservoir engineer and a production engineer. Amoco became BP. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Adams for his presentation now. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks for and thanks, Melinda, for a very informative presentation, and of course, thanks to all of the participants, finding time out of your busy schedule to to come and listen to this to these presentations that I think are very, very important in terms of informing the public as to what's really going on. And of course, thanks to Moray House for being at the forefront of making this type of information available to the public. Now, first, let me say this: I, especially as the head, as the former head of the EPA, you know, it is really regrettable and disappointing, to say the least, that the EPA would lose this opportunity to participate in such a forum. And it just get there, as always. EPA has now become the agency that is always missing in action when it comes to representation of the people. And one of their core mission is to represent the citizens and taxpayers of Guyana, who are their bosses and who pay their salaries and who they work for. But like I said, they've been missing in action. And I never expected Exxon to accept either, to be honest, because Exxon modus operandi is going into these countries and taking advantage of the people and making them, at least they believe that they're making them fools, because they obviously are not they don't have the knowledge base that they have, so they make them fools. However, they're spineless when it comes to having to stand up and face those who are as knowledgeable as they are, or even more knowledgeable than they are. So I never expected them to come before us, but I'm sure if you send them before some place where they know that they're gonna have their folks who support them, they're willingly gonna go, but they're not gonna come before people who are more knowledgeable than them to ask the tough question, because they can't, to be honest, they cannot answer the tough question. So in any case, you know, since the EPA is not being the vanguard or the guardrails to which their main role is, you know, we have to thank folks such as Melinda and Elizabeth and, you know, Mr. Lal at Kaichur News and a whole host of other folks who are courageous enough to stand up, and even in the international community who are supposed to be standing up. Now, you know, it really bothers me, and it should bother every single Guyanese and people who are interested in the environment and just quality of life, regardless of where you are, because what matters most, and Melinda touched on it, I think we've got a strong framework, a strong regulatory framework in the EPA Act. I, for one, I know there's some little bit of tweaking that I would have liked to have done, but in terms of a sound foundation, you can broaden the interpretation to include oil and gas and everything else. However, it doesn't matter what you have in an act when the owners of that act, which is the government of Guyana, they just ignore or thumb their noses at what's written into the law, what's written into the act, what's written into the EIA, and what's written into the permit, which are supposed to be the document controls to control how we operate, not only in the oil and gas industry, but in every industry. But it appears that we're tough on the little guys. A guy who runs a traffic sign, you know, I read the other day where they're trying to improve the laws as to how they're gonna, you know, tighten up on the traffic regulations. But the big boys, such as Exxon, they're allowed to get away with whatever they want. As a matter of fact, you know, it would appear to anybody that they're calling the shots. When I look at some of the changes in the EPA permit, I know for sure there's no way that anybody in the EPA understand those language to be writing it in the EPA, because nobody in the EPA right now has done a single, not even a minute of training in petroleum engineering. And I know the language that I'm seeing in the permit, the revised language since I've left, it was written by EPA. So I know that they're dictating everything else. You know, it's outrageous when, you know, we have our leaders saying that we are such great stewards of the environment, while at the same time we're supporting Exxon mantra that The reason why they should be allowed to flare, believe it or not, is because Guyana is a carbon sink. Notwithstanding what Melinda talked about, losing all of the money, but they're looking at us, hey, you know what? You guys are a pristine environment. So you've got the capacity now to be polluted and to be contaminated. There's somebody coming into your house and throwing trash all over the darn place. And then after a while, they'll leave you and you have got the mess. But this is even more dangerous because this here is impacting everybody's health. And while at the same time, they're saying that they're justifying, by the way, they're flaring. They're justifying it by saying we are a carbon sink. And so you guys can absorb, you guys have more capacity. At the same time, they're telling the rest of the world and making a commitment that they will cut back on flaring by 50% by 2030. I mean, if that is not IPAS, I don't know what else is. But like I said, that's what they do. They go into these countries and they take advantage of us. And to me, that's totally immoral. However, what even upsets me more, because sometimes I'm not even mad at Exxon, because Exxon will only do what they're allowed to do. Because this kind of nonsense, they cannot operate this way in other countries. I work for the US government at the highest level, and I know when we said jump, they said how high. It's the reverse in Guyana. They tell the government how high to jump, and we ask how high we should jump. So I'm going to get into some, just to back up some specific details of some things that are happening, and I'm sure you've been hearing some of those. And Melinda talked about the renewal of the permit, which was an opportunity for us, by the way, to actually stand up, because I had some serious heartaches over that Liza 1 permit, which was signed before I arrived, and I fixed that in the Liza 2 permit, except that they don't even follow anything that I put into the Liza. As a matter of fact, they went and added stuff to reverse what I put in it that I'm going to get into here. And I thought, by the way, Mr. Parshram, who's the current executive director, a lot of people don't even know this, it's the same person who signed the Liza 1 permit. He was there 2 years before I arrived. So here was an opportunity for him to redeem himself, really. And he obviously didn't. And I probably can sympathize with him, because I don't think he has any authority, to be honest. The politicians who were calling the shots at TPA. So I sympathize with the guy. So, but I just wanted to bring that out there. Now, the other thing that has been one of my favorite topics, full liability coverage. This is where the tire meets the road. Liza 1 did not have that. However, what it had, and we can go back, the EIA, by the way, it's what I like to call the Bible of environmental operation. That's what set the safety envelope, the environmental envelope in which you've got to act within. And it's sacred. You never go outside of those envelopes. And it said that thou shalt inject all produced gas, except under 3 circumstances: emergency, which you unexpected; startup, when you start up, you've got gas in the system, for a few hours or so, you got to flare that gas. And of course, maintenance, when you're done for maintenance, you've got to test out the system. But all of these are only supposed to last, a few hours or here or there. So when they started operating Liza 1, and by the way, they admitted that they screwed up. In Liza 1, they said that they will not flare from day 1. Those were their exact words. They will not flare from day 1. And when they started operating and the equipment went bad, the seals and everything went bad, they started begging us. They came to myself and Dr. Bino. They begged for a few days. Then when it didn't work, 30 days, we gave them up to 60 days. Then I shut them down. I brought them down from 100,000 barrels per day to 25, I think, 1,000 barrels per day to operate at a safe level. Give them a certain amount of time until they fix it, or else I'm going to shut it down completely. Well, it so happened that they fix it. But here is the audacity of these folks. You know what they were using as their excuse? That they were in a startup mode. You remember what I told you about the 3 exemptions if you're under startup, emergency, or maintenance? They said, well, we're still in startup. Now, how ridiculous is that? You're selling oil in the market, you're operating 100,000 barrels per day, and you're still in startup. So I wiped that clean. I said, hey, don't ever let me hear that again, or else, you're going to suffer worse consequences. So they pushed that aside. Well, so they started up, they fixed it. As soon as I left, it went bad again. So now they moved from the startup. Now they went to the maintenance exemption. Remember, there were three exemptions. So what I did, I wrote in, I said, so you just not for you to misinterpret what startup, maintenance, emergency means, which was in Lisa 1, there were just a few lines that you expect everybody understood what that meant. I went into great details. I myself put the language in, very lengthy language, so it would be no misinterpretation. As a matter of fact, what I put in for startup was the United States language or law that says you only have 48 hours. So there should be no misinterpretation. You have 48 hours for startup. That's exempt. So you know what they did when I left? They gave Exxon 60 days for startup. 60 days. They immediately went and changed it. Even though I was proposing 48 hours, they pushed my 48 hours aside, put 60 days. They didn't stop there. In addition to the 60 days now, they put a clause in that permit clause, 3 point something. And you know what that clause says? You could flare unlimitedly. The language said, in unplanned or planned maintenance of the gas handling equipment, where you could only flare through the gas handling equipment. Okay? So they're saying, which was the reason why they're flaring, because the gas handling equipment was in disrepair. So they're saying, as long as that piece of equipment is in disrepair, we can flare. So now that clause, that simple clause here, is allowing them to flare it's unlimited amount. So you would think that they would stop there. No, but then they've got to cover their tracks. So they're saying now, just to kerfuffle and to confuse everybody and to con people, they said, guess what? For the very first time, we're charging a fee for the flaring. This 4 to 5, now they raise it to 50. They're bragging about the $5. So let me tell you what that means. So every ton of carbon dioxide flare, they're paying a fine of $50. Oh, they're bragging all over. Well, guess what that amounts to? And I did some rough calculation because you're not getting information. That fine, and they're claiming now they're down to only, it's only 2% of the gas we flare. You see, this is where they believe that that people are ignorant. Well, 2% sounds like a really small number of anything, right? 2% of 100, they're not saying the number bar, 2% of 102 or 4%. I think they said 2 to 4%, but 4% of 120,000 barrels per day. Now I'm only talking Lisa 1. Okay, 4% of that is almost 5 million cubic feet of gas per day. All they've got to do to stop flaring is cut back production by 4,000 barrels per day. Because every barrel that comes up brings up 1,000 cubic feet of gas. So to cut back on the 4 million cubic feet that they're flaring, all you do, divide the 4 million by the 1,000, you end up with 4,000 barrels. So they would have to cut back their production from 120,000 barrels per day to 116,000 barrels per day. But guess what the problem is? If they cut back on that at today's market price, they will be losing about $500,000 per day. So here they are, we're charging them and bragging about taking in $12,000 US, fining, and we're bragging about that. So they're paying $12,000 to make $500,000 every single day. So that's the con game that they're playing. So that it's not a deterrence, which is what the law is supposed to be. It's an incentive. I'm sure many of you are business people. Wouldn't you take that deal anytime? That if you're investing $12,000 to get $500,000, I will take that deal anytime. So, which means that they will flare forever because it would cost them to put in that equipment. Now, insurance. Oh, the other thing that I heard today, I read, as a matter of fact, they're bragging now that they're operating now. The Lisa 1 has gone from 120,000 barrels per day to 140,000 barrels per day operating. Again, that's an additional 20,000 barrels per day every single day. Guess how much you're getting at this market price? That's about over $2 million per day at today's market price. And guess what? The EIA says the safe operating limit, the safe operating, those are the exact language in the EIA. The safe operating limit is 120,000 barrels per day. So now they're going to 140,000 barrels per day, 20,000 barrels per day above the safe operating limit. I have attacked this before when they were talking about it, and the EPA responded. They don't have a clue. They didn't say anything much, and now they've put it in effect. Now I want to talk about the insurance, the full coverage that I mentioned. So we, like I said, the Liza 1 did not have any insurance coverage. As a matter of fact, what it says that the company who owns the permit, and by the way, a lot of people don't realize this, Exxon does not own that permit. The permit holder is EEPGL, which is, or SO it's called, which is a limited liability company that has no assets. When they formed EEPGL was to run Guyana, it was for Guyana. And I'm used to that game that these big corporations play. When they form limited liability companies, by definition, is to insulate themselves from liabilities. So here it is now, you got the permit holder, and every line in that permit, it says the permit holder, well, it's EPGL. EPGL doesn't have any assets to cover that thing. So they're saying in the agreement now, the agreement says they can allow self-insurance, which was in Liza 1 permit. So when the guy brought Liza to me, I said, you got to be crazy out of your mind. I said, where is EPGL's assets to cover any spill? You haven't produced a barrel of oil yet. Anyway, after some fighting and stuff, they went out and some threatening. The threats, I told them I told them as long as I'm there, they will not produce a barrel of oil until they give Guyana unlimited liability coverage. So they went out, they got insurance, which was 2.5 billion, which was the highest they can get in the market. And then they had to, when they thought that was it, I said, no, who's going to cover the balance? The Macondo cost 70 billion. Who's going to cover that 68 billion after the insurance is paid, when the government of Guyana entire budget is only $2 to $3 billion, 30 times our budget. So I said, no, I'm not moving off. So they went now and they got parent company coverage to cover everything over and above the $2 billion. I put that language in the Liza 2. It says, thou shalt, in section 12.1, thou shalt have insurance. Section 12.3 says the EPA has to review that insurance policy from time to time to ensure a list of things, including that you guys are paying up your premium. And section 12.5 says that the parent company has to give a guarantee to cover everything over and above that insurance that you've bought. So that's full liability coverage, unlimited coverage. A lot of my friends would tell me, Guyana I was the first person to ever obtain for Guyana unlimited liability coverage in the whole world. Well, put it in writing is one thing. Of course, that's the language that I myself wrote into Liza 2. Guess what? They started up Liza 2 in February without any of that in place. Nothing at all. And they've got the nerve also to put my same language in all of the subsequent permits. They put it in Payara, they put it in Yellowtail, and now with the renewal of Liza 1, they put that language in there also. So now we've got two operations, Liza 1 and Liza 2, that are operating.
5 minutes.
Huh?
You have, sorry, Vince, 5 minutes left.
Okay, good. That are operating in violation of their own permit, which is a serious matter. So now all they're talking about, you hear, well, we're going to go by, we're going to get parent company coverage for $2 billion. $2 billion is a drop in the bucket, which is what I refuse anyway. So I think they're setting people up because somebody, whoever takes them to court, trust me, it's a slam dunk case. It's written in black and white in clear language. This is what you're supposed to have. Before you start up, you didn't, you start up, you're operating these facilities illegal. They're afraid that somebody is going to take them to court. They're going to go ahead and change that permit the same way they did to make the flaring legal. They're going to go and change the language. So they're preparing all of us for this 2 billion assurance. They're talking that, you know, they're using these fancy words now. And then even within the 2 billion assurance, you've got this guy who's one of the most arrogant people that I've ever met. And he has no respect for Guyana and our government. Rutledge said within that 2 billion, it has to be credible cost, it has to be reasonable cost, and it has to be legitimate cost. Even within that 2 billion. So I don't know what is there that is not legitimate, credible, or reasonable in a spill. Flaring again. And I think this here is Melinda in her case. They're playing with words. It says, well, we can flare because the language says you cannot flare under routine and normal circumstance. Well, so they're claiming now that this here is not routine. Well, we all know that because if something is break, it's definitely not routine. But they're trying to cover themselves with other language. So the problem is here, there's no enforcement, and I think Melinda covering that. Imagine one permit alone has 407 conditions. We have nobody on board that ship or any of those ships, even looking or to walking behind them, which is what we do in the US. At every facility, every critical facility, we have what we call a facility rep at every facility 24/7. So here we are telling them to be their own police, especially a company like Exxon that you believe that somehow you can trust. As a matter of fact, the World Bank and they give us $1 million to set up a petroleum unit within the agency, toward a 6-person unit, where which was to do exactly that with high-powered petroleum engineers, 10 years experience, toward a 6-person, to be on the ship, more high-powered than these guys that they've gotten on the Exxon side, to be there 24/7. When I left, and we have the document with the organization chart, the qualifications for every position. When I left, they threw that in the trash. They don't want any of that, so they're doing everything from in the office or from what Exxon reported to them. You know, some simple things. We took Exxon to court. They had 6 leaks, 6 small leaks, but the leak with the magnitude of the leak was not the problem. It just shows you that, you know what they were. You know, when you buy some kind of a piece of equipment in the store, it has a label, a warning label there, says that you shall do this. It was for some hose that they pump out through. It says you have to inspect these hoses. Would you believe 6 times Exxon used those hoses without inspection, even though the manufacturing specification says you have to, and they wrote the procedures in, and it says in the permit you have to follow all manufacturers' recommendations. They didn't do it. We took them to court, and the highest we could have fined them was $500 US. You know what they did? They refused to do it. We decided to take them to court. As soon as I left, they got rid of our attorney, and they dropped the case.
Sorry, Vince, 1 minute left.
All right, good. We had another case with Repsol where the mud that goes into the hole to keep it from blowing out. The mud was being dumped into the ocean because there was a faulty valve. And when they just reported, well, just a few gallons of mud. That was not the case. I told my staff, I want you to go and investigate on board the ship. When we got, those were the facts. They're not looking at maintenance. So those are the kinds of things where you need somebody there 24/7 that are not that are not going there. So you know, I'm going to leave the rest for question and answers, and I could talk even the Demerara River Bridge. The EPA staff came out and said you have to have.
Sorry, Vince, that's not in our portfolio at the moment.
Huh?
The Demerara Bridge is not in our
No, I was
portfolio
just
at the
talking about
moment.
EIA, the regulatory thing. When they said you're supposed to have an EIA, and they come back and the next thing you know, they overruled what the staff said to say, no, we don't need an EIA. But it's just showing you, you know, where you put something in writing, but they're not even following their own regulations and legislation and laws. So I'm gonna take a break until we start getting questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams, for your wonderful presentation. Especially that Exxon will only do what we allow them to do. So that reiterates the call that Melinda made for us to get to action. And for making it very clear where they're permitted to have flaring. It's not this continuous flaring. You know, it's the startup, it's maintenance, and it's emergency. And we need to be clear about that. And we need to, you know, as Bob Marley said all those years ago, and it is still valid today, let us stand up, get up and stand up and enforce our rights. Because do we really want to leave this as a legacy, our legacy? As sorry, I didn't actually give Isabel the credit for the statement I wrote. So that was Isabel's writing. And as she rightly said there, you know, we have to get up and stand up and for so I will give the panel 5 minutes to have an discussion between the two of you. So because we are on a very tight timeline, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So 5 minutes, please. Please go ahead.
Hey, Melinda, are they in your lawsuit? Are they really seriously saying that the modification is a restriction on flaring? Is that really serious? When is the complete opposite?
What I can do is just confirm what's in the court papers, because I can't really discuss the case. But yes, essentially what they say is that they have a right to flare, and that the modification is there to stop the flaring, that they have a right to do extended non-routine flaring. I know.
Well, well, you and I could have an offline, because all of that is obvious nonsense, as you know, probably you know the case better than I do. But everything that they put into the modification is to increase flaring. They made it unlimited flaring. There's no question the language is there. And routine and normal, how could you say that if an equipment is faulty and that's normal or routine? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And of course, they're trying to cover it with this fee, which is irrelevant to the case, I believe. But there's no question that how could, I mean, before they themselves, as a matter of fact, admitted that that was not what they were planning to do. Day one, they said, we're sorry. They came begging on bending knees to give us them a few. So they admitted, they accepted the fact that that was not part of the plan. So how, if that's not part of the plan, how could that be normal? And then, of course, the fee is an incentive. They're paying $12,000 to make $500,000 per day. How could that be a deterrence? I'll take that any day. So how could that be a deterrence?
Yeah, the maths is definitely off. Thank you very much. I like a video. Are you there? I'm not sure. He was going to.
Yes, I'm back here. Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
yes.
it's over to you, Vidya.
Right. Hi, thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. And just my role is to just moderate the question and answers, and to say, please either raise your hands or put the questions in the chat. And there are two questions already in the chat. There's one from Vanda. Vanda's asked, Dr. Adams, can you give us some insight into the shore-based hazardous
You want me to ask it?
facility? Sure, Vanda, if you can do that quickly, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Adams. Thank you so much, Vidya. So, Dr. Adams, I can't see the question anymore on the chat, but what I really wanted to ask you was, one thing was, can you give us any insight concerning the shore-based facilities that are being set up all over this country, particularly on the East Bank and on the West and on West Demerara? Some insight into these hazardous substances, chemicals, including radioactive sources, etc., that are all being placed in the midst of long-standing residential communities, number one. And number two, Could you share some information concerning the fine as head of EPA that you levied on Schlumberger Guyana Inc. for its leak of, we assume, chemicals right here on our wharf, and that you fined them the highest maximum amount at the time? If you could just give us some insight into those two things. Thank you.
Well, the first thing, I have never been in favor of, Georgetown was not designed for what it's being used for right now. And when the developers used to come to my office from foreign and other places, you know what I used to tell them? As a matter of fact, I said, there was just a big Chinese company. I told them that they need to go to the government. There's there's some vacant islands in the Essequibo River. They probably need to engage the government to see if they can use those one or two. And in fact, one of the developers did go to the government. I thought he was making progress. I don't know what the outcome was, but everybody that came to me and wanted to put up those new developments in the Georgetown, which is highly populated, was not designed for that. You may recall there was even a company that, I can't remember the company, that wanted to set up something right in Georgetown or going up by Eccles or someplace in that area. We had a problem. They never got the permit. But I remember this one distinctly. The Mangroves Gate. I remember a certain individual came to me and said they wanted to put the shore base on the West Bank, the Green Hoop area. And they asked me what I should, what I needed. I said, well, I can't prejudge, but that's not the place that you should put a shore base. They still insisted. I said, well, okay, you're gonna have to do an EIA. They asked me how long is an EIA gonna take. I said it could take as much as 2 years, but you have to go through an EIA and you may never get it done. Well, to make a long story short, that was the end of the conversation, basically. And the next thing I knew, as soon as I left, guess what they did? They went and cut down the mangroves anyway. Because that was one of the things I told them. I said, especially when you're touching mangroves, there's no question you have to do an EIA. That's, mangrove is one of the sacred things. There are all kinds of laws as to who's in charge of mangroves, etc. So they went, and it so happened that the person who was running this shore base thing, they're still part of the government. So they had their ways, they cut down the mangrove. So no, to answer your question, to make it very short, I was never in favor of putting anything in Georgetown, especially 90% of commercial traffic that comes into Guyana comes into that narrow strip there. The shallowness. I mean, why do you think we always, a lot of times we get blackout? Because the power line runs on the bottom of that river, and it's so shallow that anchors and everything damage it. So I don't understand how they can be putting those shore bases and everything in that packed community. That was not designed for it. There's no kind of a zoning in that area when it was first developed. And then you've got the traffic. You talk about moving radioactive stuff. It's not only radioactive, it's hazardous stuff, moving it along in all of that traffic on those narrow roads that was not designed for that. That was one of my biggest problem, where I wasn't giving folks permit. You remember one time we had a spill with some stuff that was stored at what's the name? Guyneck Wharf. You remember it was panic that morning when the whole drains and everything on the street was full of this white stuff. It was panic all over Georgetown. Now it could have been worse. It so happened that the material was basically not that hazardous. But imagine you can have radioactive material being transported, and then there's an accident with radioactive material. And all of these drilling tools, the stuff where they go into these wells to determine where you have oil, that's what Schlumberger and them use, are these tools. And there's a source on these tools that are highly radioactive, that you can farm these, you could just scatter radioactivity all over the place if you get a hold of it and breach it. We had a lot of breaches, like in Brazil. One time people just dump it into the garbage, and innocent people just went and pick up stuff out of the yard. It looked nice. They took it home and killed a whole bunch of people.
Dr. Adams, sorry, Dr. Adams, I know there's a lot to say. There are a couple more questions coming in.
Okay.
Our time is running out. I really appreciate that. This is so in-depth though, and really important. There's a lot to be said here. Melinda, I think this is one for you. Andre Brandley asked, is there the possibility of taking the EPA to court for not following the law in issuing the leach to one permit renewal?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if you want me to say more than that, but the answer is yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Right. Okay. And Dr. Adams, there's some more questions for you in the chat. I'll ask Andre Brandy, if they can unmute and perhaps say it quickly. The question about the gas ashore project.
Okay. Hi, Vince. This is Andre.
Hey, Andre, how are you doing?
Okay. I'm joining from Munich. I've got yes, almost missed out on this. I wonder whether it doesn't make more sense to bring the gas that Guyana needs to shore by boat and export the rest offshore. The environmental impact will be a lot less. And I think my simple back on the envelope calculations had been telling me that 3 to 4 boat loads per year would be sufficient to cover Guyana's gas needs. So my feeling is that we are building a huge infrastructure with fixed pipes from the offshore production sites to the shore, but we could get this much simpler and a much flexible way. I don't know whether you have heard about any discussions or about this alternative. I think the previous government was looking into it. The current government has absolutely no interest in it at all considering it. That's at least my feeling.
No, there has been quite a few technical discussions, with even models presented, and it looks very, very favorable. I have not myself done any analysis, but it sounds conceptually, at least, it sounds as if it makes sense. Where the other thing is that you can even do the processing of this gas offshore right there. You get a facility right there offshore and do your processing offshore. So, or you move the stuff to land. So there are those options. But I think that the government is hell bent on this idea. But here's the other thing, and of course they've got to do a study, an EIA, etc. But I think they're moving forward anyway. And here's the one thing that I don't think that people are looking at. That pipeline. My question is, the technology is not available to detect leaks in that pipeline below the sea level. And at that depth, the technology is not there. So how, and leaking that gas is very toxic to fish, very, very toxic to fish life. So how are you going to detect which, if you have a leak? And here's one of the things that can cause leak. We're in a very geodynamic area. You have earthquakes and volcanoes and everything. That's how a lot of those islands were formed. Very active. So what happens if you start getting these underwater volcanoes, mudslides, and it damages that pipeline? How are you going to even know that the pipelines are damaged and these leaks are there? And how are you going to detect them? How are you going to fix them? So those are the kinds of things that I'm not hearing anybody talking about. It's just building a pipeline and ship the gas. I know that they're going to be doing an EIA, but it's going to be interesting to see what the EIA is going to do. But getting back, Andre, it looks as if they're hell bent on building the pipeline. So,
Well, I mean, this is just what is so frustrating, that there's no real consultation and that one really puts all the alternatives on the table and discusses this openly.
Yes.
My feeling is that the current government is just basically us or the highway, and they basically in closed chambers, they make their decisions without really considering alternatives. I mean, also this Quarantine Bridge is a total craziness in my opinion. There's no traffic Guyana should be spending 100 million or 200 million US dollars to build a bridge to nowhere instead
Yeah.
of building, you know, 2 state-of-the-art ferry terminals. If traffic picks up, then you can consider in 10 or 15 years a bridge. But I just
Can I
don't
just come
understand it.
back? Sorry, Andre, can I just come back to the gas, this ridiculous gas pipeline? First of all, I think it's probably illegal because it's contrary to the obligations that Guyana put into the National Determined Contribution in 2015, where Guyana actually said we will reduce our carbon emissions. If you start to use gas, you don't reduce your carbon emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, the cost of the pipeline, it's estimated, I think, at about 900 million. We all know it's going to be more than that. Why would you do that? There is no study that shows that this is economically viable. There's been a lot of demand to find out how does this work. The government has not produced a business case for doing this pipeline. And lastly, to come back to the point of having the terminal, having these the stuff brought brought by boat from the FPSOs to the shore rather than by piping it. Well, there's a little problem with that, and it's this: the World Bank carried out a study not so long ago, and they came to the conclusion that there is little or no domestic market for gas in Guyana. So there is no, as far as we can tell, there is no economic argument for doing this. Why not take the 900 million plus and convert Guyana to 100% renewable energy, which is what the government undertook to do in 2015. Nearly 8 years later, we're arguing about oil and gas when the country is extremely well placed for renewable energy, which incidentally is also safe. I've just put into the chat the explosion at the LNG in Texas. This is not safe. And Vince has already mentioned all of the hazards that go with having a pipeline running along the bottom of the sea.
Well, maybe if I could quick answer the one point that you made. The idea is, of course, to get rid of the heavy oil burning electric plants and replacing those with gas. So that would cut your CO2 output probably by 30 to 50%. So I think that would be the argument.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disagree with you, but moving from heavy fuel oil to gas makes absolutely no sense. Guyana has undertaken to move from heavy fuel oil to renewable energy, and there is no reason whatsoever to go and use gas. There is no business case for that gas. There's no environmental argument for that gas.
I think you could make arguments the other way around too. I mean,
they have not been made. Andre, those arguments have to be made by the government of Guyana. They have to produce the information, they have to produce the studies, and they have to be done by independent experts so the people of this country can decide for themselves whether they want to have fossil fuels or whether they want to go to renewable energy. And that has not been done.
I agree with those.
Thanks, Mr. There's another question. David Modest has asked, there are two questions from, has asked if, I'm sorry, I just did the chat is,
it's full.
Sorry, given the fact that the country has been seemingly misled on the details of the quantity of oil found and the actual intentions regarding flaring, what provisions does Guyana have in place to address entities not acting in good faith? Other violations already committed, and the main parties that are extracting the oil are increasing the rate. I think what actions are any of the current political parties, regional countries, CARICOM taking to address these risks, the associated risks of any of the oil spills?
Well, I know Melinda, I know what Melinda answer was here right away, and I agree with her. you know, I think Melinda answered the question. You could take you have legal recourse, but in terms of CARICOM, you know, CARICOM want to be part of the action too, as far as I can tell. You know, everybody, you know, Trinidad wants to be part of the action. Barbados now wants to be part of the action. I know there were letters written by the OGGN, the organization that Darsh is part of, and I know Andrea knows about. They have written a letter to Mayor Motley herself and to CARICOM. So, but I think I might be misreading, but it looks as if they're glad that they've got an opportunity to benefit economically from Guyana's oil, and they're participating.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's important to realize that ExxonMobil has come to Guyana for one reason only, and that is to make money. That's it. The job of the EPA and the job of the government is to protect Guyana. The government is there for one purpose only, and that is the well-being of the people of Guyana. It's not there to go on a spending spree on infrastructure projects or talk about economic justice or any of the other things that they like to talk about as an excuse for doing oil and gas. Their sole purpose is to protect the people of this country.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of CARICOM, Mayor Motley was at the UN meeting saying, how much warmer does the earth have to get before we stop oil and gas, before we stop fossil fuels, arrives in Guyana and decides that actually she wants to be, she's in support of fossil fuels. There is no limit to the hypocrisy of politicians. So let's not fool ourselves.
Yep, and just on the, just quickly, just on the topic of being, you know, of the government protecting us, but even then the government doesn't even follow the people who are supposed to be advising them. When we were putting together and this here is important, and maybe it might even help Melinda's case. There was a team when we were doing the Payaro, a team of the EPA, GGMC, who's written into the contract, by the way, as the technical team, the Department of Energy, and the government-owned consultant, this lady Redford from Canada. And we all agreed, and it's documented. EPA has the documents, the Department of Energy has the document, GGMC has the document. We all agreed unanimously and directed Exxon that there shall be no flaring and there shall be no dumping of water. We agreed up to August. That was the position when I left. And lo and behold, I don't know what happened, but until now, nobody can see that report and to see the drafts of the documents where we, the government technical people, advisors, and the Canadian advisors advised the government, it documented that there shall be no flaring. We even met with Exxon and told Exxon, this is our position now, this is what you're gonna have to abide with. And suddenly, a month after I left, I was shocked when I saw that it's just like if we never had any such discussion. So again, it's getting back to, there's no, in terms of us enforcing anything, everything is so politicized. So the technical people are being overruled by the government. And that's what it's taking, that's what's happening here. It's not protecting the people anymore. It's just a thirst for this oil money. That's what it is. The politicians, all they want to do is, I don't care what I have to do to get my hands on this oil money. That's all that this is about.
So just to say, and just something, and I'm sorry I don't have the details, to note that Caribbean civil society, and certainly within Trinidad, some of the environmentalist groups and so, did say that they should be involved in some of these discussions because of their efforts. So even if the governments are not being interested, the civil society groups are concerned, and there is the IHCR hearing and so on that happened on the extractive industries. Hesley, I'm sorry, Mrs. Hesley Jackson, please ask a question. And friends, I know we're over the time limit, so this is probably a final question from Hesley Jackson. Of course, if you want to ask any questions in the chat, and I know Melinda is replying to questions in the chat. Thank you, Melinda. So, Mr. Jackson, Are you still there, Hesley Jackson? Yes. I'm so sorry I did not see your hand on the video because the spotlight was on the speakers. Right. Sorry about that.
Okay, I'm now off the mute, so I'll be as brief as I can. I have some background in environmental because I worked in several plants, and always my responsibility was both air and water, and you know, any contaminants that got into them, etc. So now my question is this: it appears like if we have an EIA that is valid for any project, and we have an EPA that is supposed to take care of Guyana's laws and see that all these are obeyed. And what have we got that is punitive once these laws or regulations or rules are not obeyed? Because I remember the $500 that you charged SO, and that got waved away. I don't think you got that $500 yet, Dr. Adams. But what can we do to make it punitive? Because in all my exposure to all of this, there were always laws and rules and regulations that were cut and dried. There were attorneys and everything, and put a little bit of humor in this. I remember my manager got very excited. I was in an ammonia plant and we were doing our section was doing nitric acid production. And of course, there was a little bit of a hiccup and some nitric oxide got outside. Of course, the minute that happened, there was a little NO2, and he saw the EPA, the EPA person who checks on these things on the ridge overlooking it, and he shut the plant down. And when I went up in a rage to him to say, look, this was temporary. This was just like about 5 minutes, it would have gone away. He pointed out to me that they had recently put laws in the country that says that the plant manager could be sent to jail for breaking the environmental procedures. So far, I haven't heard anybody address this. What punitive?
Yeah. Perhaps I could start on the punitive actions. And I think all of the things that you mentioned are possible. So just to start with the fine, the schedule of fines in the Environmental Protection Act is completely out of date. It was put in there 26 years ago, and it has not been updated. So I think the first step, because we should focus on solving the problem, the first step would actually be to tell the government that schedule needs to be updated, and there's no reason why a group couldn't do that. The second thing is you can use the provisions in the Environmental Protection Act. So, for example, there's a provision that says the EPA has to enforce the polluter pays principle. They're not doing it. There's another principle, which is the strict liability principle. They're not doing it. They have the powers to shut down operations, to cancel the permit, to suspend the permit, to change the conditions of the permit. There are even criminal offenses in the act, which would cover much of what you're talking about. If the company is found guilty, the director's staff can go to jail. So the remedies are there. They're simply not being used. And we should bear that in mind, because those are also things that one would need to possibly insist that the EPA does. And I think that's why the public has got to call the EPA and the government to account. I just want to add two things. Vidya mentioned that the CSOs in the Caribbean want to have a say in this, and of course they should. There's absolutely no way that any of our sisters and brothers in the Caribbean should be excluded. But I think at the same time, the message needs to get to the business sector, because it's the business sector that is going to be very badly affected. I've put in the chat a link to a moratorium call. If you click on that, you will see a map that shows where oil could end up if there is a well blowout. And it is actually very instructive and actually quite terrifying map. So I would just invite everyone to have a look at that.
Yeah, just let me add, and I totally agree with everything that Melinda said. And you remember earlier I said that we've got a sung act, except there's some tweaking. And one of the first tweaking that I had started doing, as a matter of fact, was exactly that, the fine. Because when I got on board, we had like 5 fines that we imposed on five companies, and all of them was the maximum, which was $1 million. That should have been many, many millions of dollars. And that particular one with the 500, that was the maximum, again, because of what the schedule called for, the 500. And you're absolutely right. They refused to pay it. And that was when we decided to take them to court. We filed a case. And as soon as I left, the new government dropped the case against Exxon. And not only did they drop the case, they got rid of the lawyer, the EPA lawyer, brilliant young man, who was prosecuting the case for us. And I think that answers Vanda's question too. I didn't get to her answer when she asked me about the fine that we had imposed, I think, on Schlumberger. The fine was small because we were limited as to how much we could fine them.
And Christine Samaru asks in the chat, how do we continue to engage the general public and mobilize the people in Guyana? Regular citizens are having these same discussions and worries, and that is, of course, the eternal question, which is probably good to end this Q&A part because we've gone over our time.
Your wonderful moderation and facilitation, and for saving me too. Thank you. I'd like to thank both of the panelists for their very in-depth, honest look at the situation and the clarity with which it was delivered. Thank you very much for your call to action. And it's now up to each and every one of us. We're all responsible for what we are going to do and what we're everyone to decide what they can do. You can write a letter, you can find a way to protest, we can get together, we can bring court actions, we can find a way to make the system work for us. Because right now, we are the ones who are paying for it. So let us go back in our quiet moments and think of how we can network and make actions happen that will bring the, we're still a very young, do it. We need to do it while we can before it becomes an endemic behavior. There have been protests from the inception, so we can build on that and make it happen for us, so we leave a better future for all the generations that have come. I'm going to leave here with nothing. So maybe we can make it better for everyone else. I'd like to thank Moray House very much for holding this space all these years during this very turbulent time in the industry. I'd like to thank Brendan for walking me through what I had to do here. And thank you all for joining, for your time and your energy and for your commitment. So until the next session, thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.